Okay, uh, we thought of making a short video on public sector performance. Just to start the session, I just wanted to put your attention about the annual reports published by Ministry of Finance 2022. I just uh, read the content. You see the first one, fiscal policy strategy and challenges, economic development in 2021, global economic developments, and final budget position. Under the final budget position, you get the financial performance. The first part of chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, of course, it's about the environment in which the public sector operate in the particular year. Second, you get the performance in government's revenue part, and next chapter you get expenditure performance, then the cash flow budget or the cash flow statement and budget deficits, development finance. Then there's a special chapter on performance of state-owned enterprises, SOEs. You see the energy, state banks, water, different sectors. Then public financial or the finance management, in the human resource management, then the financial statement. So what I want to communicate to you by showing this particular annual reports, the performance you can really, public sector performance may look at from different, perspective, different way. So you can look at the public sector performance from macro level and, the organization levels. Then when you take the organization level, there are different structures. So you may talk about the state-owned enterprises. Maybe you may talk about the municipalities or provincial councils or Pradeshi Sabha or provincial councils. So thereby performance may in public sector, basically there are three layers. One is the central government level. Second one is the, Palas Sabha, the 9 provinces, and the third one is local government and provincial councils, including municipalities, urban councils, etc. If you go to the page number 218, I think 218 this page, I'm just going to that. 285, yes, 208 financial statement. You get the financial statement, the performance in the public sector. Now you see the revenue, you have so much of revenue and you will end up with a huge, deficit of budget deficit of so much. So thereby each year you see here 2.08 trillion in this year, 2021 and 2020, of course, it's much more. If you go to the balance sheet, of course, financial position, again, you get the total assets here, total assets of the public sector, 2.8 trillion. And here it is 2.6 trillion total assets. But on the other hand, if you look at the total liabilities, you see liabilities are 17 trillion. Total assets 2 trillion and liabilities 17.8 trillion. If you look at the 2020, the same scenario, you get assets of 2.6 and 15 trillion, 15.3 trillion, liability. You see that? So thereby you see the basic logic of accounting, financial accounting, assets minus liabilities. Of course, your equity is really negative. So your net assets value, if you look at the public sector, it's continuously, not in 2021, 2022 and 2020, but if you look at the past years, continuously, its net assets has been really, net assets have been really, negative. So thereby you can understand the economic crisis or economic situation behind this particular country. So no one is interested in this data and no one is using. So we will discuss that matter later on. Then if you look at the statement of cash flow, of course, there are operating cash flows. You see that operating cash flows so much, and net cash flows from operating activities is really negative. It's almost 1.2 trillion. If you look at the financing or investing cash flows, again, cash flows from investing activity is positive because we are borrowing, more borrowing. But if you look at the investment activities, again, the cash flows from investing activities, of course, again, you see cash flows from financing activities, of course, you see much. I'm sorry, cash flows from investing activities is 2.05 trillion negative, but financing activities, it's positive. So what I want to communicate to you is that if you take the total cash flow situation of the public sector, you see that always it's a negative bank OD. Cash and cash equivalent always negative. So this has been really the key characteristic of the public sector. So I'm not going to, to discuss other aspects. I just wanted to highlight the financial information, financial measurements, financial indicators about the public sector. It's really, dangerous. So in such a situation, can you make a clear or the opinion about the financial statement in such a situation? I don't think. So auditors, the general even need to, make a worse opinion about the financial statements. Okay. Now we will come to the slide presentation. I just share it with you. And you see that this public sector performance measurements, we have learning. So I highlighted the financial aspects and the seriousness of the public sector in Sri Lanka. So based on this session, what I will do is I will just look at the characteristic of less developed countries, describe the public sector performance measurements and justify why it is required, and describe the issues in public sector performance. So when you look at the public sector performance, of course, it's related to good organizational performance. So you need, of course, good organization or good indicators about the performance just to supply goods and services to the publics that will ensure the efficient and effectiveness of the public sector organizations and departments and state-owned enterprises. Public sector performance measurement can contribute to attain such performance level because it may be an input for achieving good governance. So thereby, to start to have a good governance, of course, you need performance indicators. It will directly contribute, public sector performance directly contribute to establish good governance in the country, whatever. So what is good governance? Good governance is responsiveness, the accountability. So you are accountable to the public, transparency, whatever the things you do, the activities, it has to be transparent, and combating corruptions, you have to, avoid, and predictable legal framework. There should be a legal framework. We should know that this is the way we want to act. So legal framework, of course, make discipline, make people disciplined. So thereby, so it has to be a predictable legal framework. If you did something wrong, then you know what will happen. So that is the predictability. Then the participatory governance, it includes people's participations, organizational participants, people in the different provinces, whatever the level, whether they are less privileged or not, there should be a way of, participating in the mechanism. So thereby participated governance is a one good characteristic of good governance. So responsiveness, accountability, transparency, combating corruptions, and predictable legal framework and participatory governance. So described in this way, good governance can be seen as an important thought through insufficient condition for achieving good organizational performance. Important though insufficient conditions for achieving organizational performance. So without corporate good governance, it's very difficult to have the good organizational performance. Then when we look at the public sector performance measurement, of course, the production of performance by public sector organization, it includes select. So when you one side you produce information. So the people who are involved with the organizational activities of the public sector may produce, public sector performance of the indicators. For example, Ministry of Finance produced the financial statement for the country. If you go to the Pradesi Sabha or Palas Sabha or municipal council, they will produce the financial performance, they will supply. It includes selecting performance areas that will be measured, developing performance indicators, collecting, analyzing data, and the reporting performance information. So one side would be when you define the performance measurement, one side would be the supply side. So supplying, public sector informations. So you provide, different indicators, maybe profit figure, maybe cash flow, maybe operating cash flow, maybe number of clients you have, maybe number of complaints you receive, whether it is qualitative or quantitative. It's not a matter. You may provide performance indicators. If you refer to the water board, state-owned enterprises, they talk about number of connections, the water supply, number of connections. They may talk about the number of non-revenue water, like NPL in banking sector. They may talk about non-revenue, unauthorized access of water, non-revenue water. So there are different kind of indicators based on the organization, nature, and the background. So if you go to the water board, again, I am telling you that they may talk about the number of connections or number of customers, number of complaints, cost per employees. Those are indicators. In addition to that, they may talk about the income, net income, expenses, assets, liabilities. Maybe the performance indicators, if you look at the financial performance, maybe accrual basis, maybe cash basis. If you go to departments, of course, modified cash accounting. If you go to state-owned enterprises like electricity board and water board, so you will get the accrual accounting based performance index. So you collect data, analyze data, and reporting performance information maybe according to the legislation requirement or maybe according to your practice. So it depends. You reports, you perform. So thereby, when you look at what is performance, you may define the performance from supply side. So you have the different indicators, you provide, collect, analyze, and reports. That's the supply side of information. Then the other side is, of course, the demand side. The demand for performance information defined by the actual or desired use of performance by the organization, internal and external. So demand side is the usage, how we are going to use. For example, I told you, I showed you the Ministry of Finance annual reports. Who really are we using that information? Are you as public, as citizens of the country, are we using? Do we refer to those information? So do we know the operating cash flow of 2020 of the country? Financing cash flow or investing cash flows? Do we know the value of the assets? Do we know the value of the the liabilities, and what is the net assets? Something like that. So thereby, are we using usage sides? So users may be the managers, policymakers, and their advisors. Those are external. Internal, of course. You can talk about external, like customers, taxpayers, citizens, elected, people, parliament members, etc. Appointed officials, managers at high level within the public sector hierarchy. And also in certain cases, demand may be from international donor agencies like World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank. So what I want to communicate you is that the performance measurements may be looked at from supply side, performance information may be looked at from demand side. So demand side means, are we providing information, and supply demand side would be the, are we using. So thereby, according to supply and demand theory, if these two parties are satisfied, we call it equilibrium. So equilibrium of performance measurements. We know that in public sector, we don't have the equilibrium. We have dissatisfied or over provided information. Anyway, so that's how we see the public sector performance measurement. Then we have specific characteristics in public sector. Especially in, we call it developing countries or less developed countries. The first one is a low institutional capacity. Low institutional capacity means weakness in regulatory practice. We have the central bank, a regulatory body, whether it is, strong. We have the COPE committee, we have the COPA committee, we have the, Sri Lanka Sri Lanka Telecom Regulatory Board. So likewise, we have many, regulatory bodies. Our question is, are they strong or weak? A low level of public accountability. We have low level of public administrative inefficiencies, limited human resources, lack of facilities, insufficient funding. So this is called a low institutional capacity. So our country is having this characteristic. The next one is a limited involvement of stakeholders. As I told you, you can talk about many number of stakeholders in the public sector. We have many, not like a corporation, private sector organization. When you take a public sector organization, public sector, it has many, variety of diversity of stakeholders. Public sector officials and civil servants are powerful groups. If you take the public sector official, top ranked people, for example, divisional secretaries and secretaries of ministries, chairman or CEOs of state-owned enterprises. So they are more powerful. And also international donors such as funding agencies and non-governmental organizations and NGOs are much more powerful. In this many number of stakeholders, diversity stakeholders category, what happened is we have limited number of stakeholders who are having power and they are dominating. So thereby other stakeholders, for example, general public is having less privilege or less power. That is another characteristic. High level of corruption. So you can define the corruption in different way, but we define corruption here as all behaviors of public sector officials and civil servants to misuse their power in decision-making process for their personal gain that hamper the public interest. So that is what we mean. So if you lose the power, if you abuse the power, we label it as a level of corruption. So you may talk about the level of corruptions. You can talk about top level corruptions where, top people, ministers and secretaries and, top politicians involved. And also you may talk about low level of corruptions where you take little money to get something done, so etc. So whatever the corruptions, if you look at the developing countries, high level of corruption is there. High level of informality. When you take this country, there are key positions. If you take the public organization, you have the original, we call it Adipati, Mahabanku Adipati, Viganaka Adipati, Agravinishakara, likewise Upakulapati. So we have many position in the public sector, and those people are really responsible for the public interest. But if they are really not making their organization much more really systematic, if they have, certain favoration for certain groups, and then it is very difficult for them to, ensure the formality. So thereby we call it informalities there, related to the often relative weak specification of property rights and other formal process to regulate economic act. So what I want to communicate to you is that these four characteristics are inherent to the less developed public sector in general. So thereby what we have to do is just to improve that powerful people. For example, World Bank, IMF, Asian development, and also the global trend, neoliberalism. The global trends influence us to have the public sector reforms. Just because of our weakness, just because of our inefficiency, just because of public sector is not performing well, just because of public sector is inefficient. So the powerful people means those who have resources, not only money, even technical abilities, even other capacities, maybe IT abilities, maybe financial capacity, maybe political capacity. So those who have in power really tell us, you do this. So that is called public sector reforms. Public sector reforms is basically addressing the issues what I discussed in my previous slides, the key characteristic of public sector. So one reforms may be the decentralization. Decentralization means giving, power to the down. So when, I think you can remember in management accounting, when we are, decentralized power, for example, when group of organization is there, when power is down, making down, we need different mechanism of control. Maybe a good reporting system, maybe transfer pricing performance indicators, maybe controllable measurements are required. So thereby decentralization as a crucial element of the public sector reforms in developing countries. So most of the, for example, state-owned enterprises, we will give more autonomy for the people there. So you manage and you look after your area. So there are a lot of, decentralization programs being introduced for different organizations in the public sector, especially for state-owned enterprises. Decentralization implies the transfer of public authority from central to intermediate or local governments. So, so you central government, then Palasabha, then provincial councils or urban councils, municipal councils, etc. So that from that angle, not only from that angle, even from the ministry levels to their organizations, you may talk about the decentralization. Similar transfer from Sri Lanka, Ghana, and India implemented programs that have increased organizational autonomy through decentralization in order to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the government. That's what I'm saying. So decentralization is one kind of public sector reforms, but it may come from different names. Maybe performance measurement related, maybe accounting related public sector reforms, maybe legislation related public sector reforms. So the ultimate objective is to make people more powerful in the down. Then other one is marketization. This aspect includes such changes in the introduction of contract management, private-public partnerships, privatization, customer, peopleization, benchmarking, other types of performance comparisons, internal markets for administrative services, and contract competition. So those are the new form of public sector reforms coming under the marketization. And other aspect is anti-corruption. And anti-corruption programs or anti-corruption program may be introduced by the different donors, maybe UNDP, World Bank, IMF, USAID, Asian Development Banks. This is to improve the strength, the control of the government. Anti-corruption programs. Okay, then demand for information. Due to these characteristics, what I mentioned earlier, the demand for performance information in these countries was rather limited. People, citizens, even you may talk about parliament member or a senior citizen or senior or a people who really work for an organization, government organization, top level. You ask what is the level of assets, liabilities, cash flows, budget deficits, and any other indicators. They are really, they don't demand, they just focus on something else. Why? Because they need to maintain the system, this corrupted system, this low-level capacity system. So to maintain this system, they are not much more sensitive to the performance. They just take arbitrary decisions just to convince others. The high level of corruption and informality may have restricted the demand for performance information. So one reason for a low level of demand is the corruption and the informality. Corruption hinders the demand for performance information because public officials and civil servants tend to make decisions mainly based on an assessment of their personal gains. So when you say corruptions and informality, you focus on your personal gains, maybe your network, maybe a group of people. You are focusing a group of people's gain. So thereby, rather than assessments of the influence on the organization. For example, if you look at the big project in the country, if you look at the really last year budget, even the president, the finance minister, in his 2022 budget speech, telling that, say, we had inefficient projects, we had low yield, we implemented, we undertook by getting loans, very low yield or inefficient projects. So thereby you are not evaluating the performance. You don't. So when you take performance, you may take planning related performance, implementation related performance, or you may take the output related performance. So you can categorize the performance. So when the corruption is there, your ultimate objective is to not to serve the people. So you may have hidden agendas. So thereby you don't need the real data or the data pattern to be identified. Furthermore, as performance measurement systems are formal systems, in the context of high informality, they can expect to have a predominantly ceremonial role. So the performance, just for the name, annual reports published in their websites. No one is interested. If you look at some informations are not rational, some informations are wrong, some informations are missing. It's not professional. So no one is worried about that. So demand is very low. This would imply that there is a formal demand to produce performance information, but actual use of information is limited. The performance measurement systems then decouple from everyday practice, and there is a loose coupling between these system and organizational decision-making activity. So there is a gap between the what is being expected and what is being measured. In recent years, however, demand for formal information seems to be increasing due to various factors. I hope that I think that the demand for information a little bit increasing. That's why if you look at this Ministry of Finance annual reports, they are published in 2021. That's good. So that means there are certain pressures from needy people. For example, World Bank, IMF, ask information for them to monitor. Maybe credit rating agencies, they pressure to the government. We need this information. So thereby, you see that there is a little bit trend, even though it's in general it's limited, but there is a tendency of pressurizing public sector organization, public sector to provide more information, like donor agencies, international organization for various purposes. But if you look at the academic like us, if we do engage in research and if you influence, so it's a matter, but I don't think that academics in this public sector is crucial. Supply performance information. Supply performance in public sector organization also probably is rather limited. given the low level of stakeholder involvement, there was not much pressure from a stakeholder to allocate information, and most likely public sector organizations provide performance information only to restricted number of powerful stakeholders such as House of Representatives, parliaments. Nowadays, however, the involvement of some stakeholders in the central government and certain donors is increased. So supplying information also, not much more. So thereby we have, not a equilibrium situation with regard to the performance measurements, but there's a trend. But if you run different projects under different loan schemes, there may be a condition in the projects. You need to provide these indicators, interim financial reporting, interim reporting. If such a mechanism is there, they tend to provide such information. But even though those information provided, those are really, just mere provision, no one is using. So just to conclude that the public sector performance can be defined from different perspectives. We use here demand and supply approach. So even though there are many ways of measuring performance, we use supply and demand. So what we are trying to do is we talk about the characteristic of public sector. Due to this characteristic, what we are arguing is information performance measurement from the supply side and performance required from the user sides are really poor, inadequate, limited. So thereby public sector performance in Sri Lanka, in addition to the, as well as other developing countries, suffering from, a poor quality, and volume is very low with regard to the performance and their usage. If you, for example, if you ask accrual based, now there's a accrual based project is going on under public sector reforms. If you talk to the people, politicians, even some secretaries of ministries, they don't know this. They ask, what is the purpose of accrual account? We don't use it. What is the use of numbers? Something like that. So what I'm trying to say is, when supply side and demand side both poor in public sector Sri Lanka. But you have to remember, for a good governance, public sector performance is required. So thereby, if performance is not measured, not understand, not used, what happens is, again, those characteristics which I mentioned earlier is, continuing. So thereby, it's a cycle, it's a process. Performance is required to good governance. Good governance is depend on performance. So if there is no link between these two, what happens is the criteria which I mentioned earlier, the characteristic which I mentioned earlier, of course, will continue. Ultimately, powerful people will get the life, and powerless or the less privileged people, that is the majority, they don't have a life. That's all. Thank you very much.